Hi everyone, my name is Abdul and I am a neuroscientist. And today I am accompanied with Yvette. She is a psychotherapist and she did her postgraduate certificate in educational psychology. Then she did her master's. That was actually a 4-year training program, and she did that in psychoanalytic child psychotherapy program. And it's been 30 years she has been actually working in this field. And today, so we'll be talking on childhood trauma and how does the factors of shame and self-esteem are linked with that. Thank you so much, Yvette, for joining me today.
Pleasure.
So the first question is like, how does the childhood trauma, just tell us like about the trauma. What's trauma, and how does it manifest either consciously or unconsciously in childhood?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess trauma is a word that's getting used a lot, and I think sort of the general consensus is in terms of a definition is that trauma involves ourselves being so overwhelmed with emotion that's beyond what our mind or our brain can tolerate. So we don't have the resources to be able to organize and deal with those emotions and feelings and experiences. I think that's generally how we define trauma.
So like, as you have been dealing with the family and child psychotherapy, right? You have been practicing, it's as you told that it's been 10 years that you have been working in that. So like, what's the role of parents in child complexes, like the complexes of child, like the complexes that are shown in childhood, and what's the role of parents in that?
Well, I guess from my training, from my understanding of the development of us all, parents are everything to do with our experiences. I'm going to go back and say, when we think about the word trauma, often people will go to those big ticket sort of items of experiencing maybe family violence. I don't know about in the States, but in Australia here we have a big problem with culturally with family violence. And so generally people will associate, a child experiencing trauma with being exposed to family violence or potentially, physical abuse or even verbal or psychological abuse or sexual abuse. But when you think about a child and I don't know if you've seen a baby being born, birth itself is a trauma, in a sense. It's sort of the whole experience of coming into the world after being sort of so tightly held in a warm space and being thrust into this sort of the world. It can be incredibly overwhelming, and
We can say that that's a kind of a symbolic trauma. That's true.
Yes, so you if you see a baby being born, you see them, they flail their arms, and that sort of the whole body sort of shows a response similar to what we would do if we were in a traumatic situation, and so the first thing that infant will need is to be physically scooped up and held, and often that's an instinctive, first thing that a mother will do or primary care will do. Scoop up that baby and hold the baby, and then hold the baby often to the breast, as a way to soothe that infant. So, I think when we think about trauma, we're also thinking about what might mitigate it, what might allow for that trauma to be dealt with, managed, or even transformed into something that can be useful to that infant. So when we think about that, we think, that as Winnicott, famous child psychoanalyst Winnicott sort of said, there isn't really a child without a mother. There's no infant without a mother, because in those very early moments of life, the infant becomes an infant, becomes an integrated unit through the experience of that holding, the physical holding.
That's true.
Also the psychological holding. He talks about primary maternal preoccupation, and that that holding of the infant in mind through the gestation period, and then also in those early days and weeks of life. There's a really powerful and necessary function there that enables the infant to know they exist, that they exist. The touch of their skin, for example. Esther Bick.
With that, we could say that maybe they develop a sense of trust and mistrust, as also mentioned by Erik Erikson in his psychosocial developmental model. So it's very much same, like as you said, that the sense of touch, right? So it's maybe like they develop a kind of a relation or a sense of belonging with the parents, and also trust. And if they had a satisfactory experience with the parents, then it could be like they could develop a sense of trust, right? Security. And if not, then maybe it's like mistrust, right? And it might have impact on them throughout their adulthood, right? So it could alter their further relations, right? So
well, it's interesting to talk about trust and mistrust, because I think in a sense, what I'm talking about in those very primitive moments, very early in life, what I'm really talking about is a precursor to the development of a relationship that can involve trust. But it's sort of not quite, not like as where you think of trust in a sort of more verbal way. We're talking about, pre-verbal and very.
That was the model by the psychotherapist. Sorry, what was the name which you mentioned?
Esther Bick, back in she wrote back in the 60s. I think she wrote a paper then. She wrote another one back in the 80s. She was a child psychoanalytic psychotherapist.
There's also one model. It's very similar to the one you're mentioning. It's by Stan Grof, I believe, and that's like the 4 matrices or something like that. And it's very similar that when the child is in the womb and during the process of childbirth, how he experiences fear, vulnerability, trauma since the time of delivery. So it's very much related to that. So he said that actually during the child birth, right, he experiences hopelessness and all such situations like that. So it seems very similar to that matrices, that 4 matrices, I believe, of Stan Grof. It's very similar to that.
I wonder if he sort of had I'm not familiar with Stanley Goff. Was it Stanley Goff, did you say?
Yep.
I'm not familiar, but I'm wondering if he perhaps had he was maybe influenced by some of the ideas of Melanie Klein, who perhaps way back, and even Anna Freud, Freud's daughter.
Yeah, I understand.
Spent a lot of time, but these people spent a lot of time observing infants and really gaining a sense of from their own experiences of observing the infant, gaining a really good picture of what was going on. And another person who did that was Esther Bick, and she sort of advocates that be a really important part of the training of a psychotherapist who works with children, because when you're observing, you're tuning you're actually tuning a part of yourself that that's able to receive the non-verbal communications of the infant. Because as we know, the infant and the mother, and you would probably know a little bit, quite a lot about this, is the right brain to right brain connection between the infant and the mother. Dr. Alan Shaw, I think he describes himself as a neuropsychoanalyst. He describes this, this interlocking that occurs from, day one between the mother and the infant, right brain to right brain communication, how that process is integral in the development of an infant. Not only integral in the development of,
and that's like the prenatal and that's like the prenatal things going on, right? It's not like after the development, it's just prenatal, right?
Well, what he describes is antenatal, so it's from birth on. But there's also a lot of discussion and research into pre-birth. The connecting pre-birth. But I mean, Winnicott talked about the process of the mother just holding the infant in her mind. That again being a way of her creating a space. For when this baby was born, or when this baby's born, to be able to connect and build a connection, a connection that allows that infant to know that they, not only that they exist, but that they are worthy of, the time and the attention and the attunement and how important that is to the healthy development of that baby.
So like that's like very primitive stages, right? When it's very early stages. So what about when the child is like when he starts, or he is in the process of developing child ego, right? He is just in the process of developing his own personality, right? Probably at the age of 2 or 3 maybe, or it's either the age of 6 he develops his own ego or develops his own personality, and before that's just like Jung named the term called participation mystique. It's like mostly identifying with the unconscious of your parent. Until that point, the child doesn't have his own or her own ego, right? So I was wondering if you could just tell us, like, what impact of parents are there on the children at very early age, like in the school going or before that, like from the age of 2 to 6, and how does it actually have an impact throughout the childhood?
Well, you may have heard of John Bowlby and attachment theory, and that that actually discusses that the child's ego is earlier, much earlier. The child at the age of 1 and 2 and is already a little person who experiences the parent and relies very much on that attunement of the parent, and that's been something that's been building from before they were born. There's this psychic connection that they can rely on, and when that's healthy, when they have what Bowlby would describe as a secure attachment, then that allows them to separate quite comfortably and begin to make connections with other people in their life, and probably as we can talk about it in terms of a relationship template. That template can be, that blueprint can be replicated, in every other relationship that child might have in their life. And
so as you just said, there would be like the imprints that would pass on to the relation further in adulthood, right? Or maybe in childhood with the friends in school. So there are like many questions which arise from here, like So we can say that that's the point where complexes are shaped for a child, right? If
Can
if
be.
it's a positive experience, then he would have like a very healthy ego and a very healthy childhood, right? But if that experience, that sense of security or that belonging with the parent, really the mother, right? Because she is involved with the nourishment. If it's not healthy, then the child would continue suffer, right? And how does it impacts, or how does it actually generates the shame or inferiority within child?
Mm. Well, it's an interesting question, and one that I'm sort of, I guess I'm exploring a lot. I mean, I guess in a sort of, perhaps in a crude way, we could say when a child, maybe what I should sort of say is what we also know about a child, for example, a child of the age of 2, right, is that their survival relies on a level of egocentricity. You know, I mean, or younger than 2. You know, the baby cries. That's their way of communicating. I need nourishment. I need, you know, I need milk, or I need comfort. You know, that's how they get their needs met. And in doing so, what it tells them in that process is that they are the centre of the universe, you know. And Freud talks about it, you know, and he talked, I can't remember if it was Little Hands, he talked about it, and Winnicott talked about, you know, the infant that drops, you know, something off the side of his high chair, and the mother picks it up and puts it back, and then he drops it again, and what he's testing out is, I can make you do what I need. I'm in control, and that's that you know, that's important. And it's gradually
Is that like what you say is, you actually so with that we can say that the child doesn't develop self autonomy, right? If the mother is constantly doing something for him or her, right, then how would he develop self autonomy, right? Or how would he actually develop sense of confidence, right? How would
right.
he
Well,
actually trust his own abilities?
well, so this is what was going to say is that can't go on forever, can it?
Exactly.
What has to happen is that the mother has to gradually allow that infant to
Separate.
learn that he's not.
And maybe that's the point where the role of father comes. Maybe.
Absolutely. Well, absolutely. The role of the father can be a really important one in allowing that separation. For example, the mother not getting up to every single cry in the
Yeah.
night after, you know, a certain amount of time. The father says, well, actually, I think she'll be all right for a little while, you know. You know, you have a little bit more rest, and, you know, but it happens in a very mindful, you know, to use a kind of modern catchphrase. It happens in a way, ideally, happens in a way where there's a lot of thinking and feeling going on.
But I believe like the initial layer of the child's upbringing should be feminine, right? What I mean is like the very basic grounds, they are feminine. The initial nourishment is definitely by the mother, right? If that's not like in a healthy way, like the sense of belonging, security, protection, and trust, and all these things comes with like a good relation with the mother, right? These are not the things that the father would give. The father maybe helps, or for sure he helps, like in a sense of initiative, right? Determination, in self autonomy, right? But like the belonging, uh, or in a very uh, or in a very general way, we can say the sense of eros, right? That's from some motherly figure, and that should be very healthily built. That's what I think.
I think that's what's usual. I think that's what's, what we'd say is the usual picture. Although, there's always variations on that. Not every woman, for example, experiences all of those.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's where the complexes and traumas start, right? Isn't that?
Well, they can, absolutely. They certainly can. And certainly what we know too is that, that period for the mother of particularly with the first baby, the first child, that period of the gestation and then giving birth, I mean, it can be quite traumatic for the mother too. And it can also potentially trigger traumas from her own infancy, her own experience. So when, we know that, for example, postnatal depression can be an experience, quite a fairly common experience for many women. The origins of that might lie in their own sort of repressed or, experiences of their own infancy or early childhood that suddenly, get kind of brought back to the surface.
Actually, that's a very, very important thing you actually raised, like the impact of repressed, unconscious, and unlived lives of parents. How does it have an impact on the child, right? Because that's maybe where the point where the scapegoating starts, or maybe because that's very, it becomes very dangerous, I believe, and it's very harmful when something is like unconscious, right, and or repressed, but it suddenly bursts. And it's very simple, like when the child, right, he breaks a glass, and the child is like 3 or 4 years old, right, and the mother, she had maybe a similar response or a parental ego internalized from her parents, and what happens is that she would give a same response to that child, right, and he would actually internalize that dark parental ego in him or in her, right, and that's the point where he would actually repress or suppress even maybe make his ability to make mistakes, right, because he would be afraid, because when he actually did that, he was punished, right, he was scolded. So maybe a possibility that that's the point where actually children go for perfection, or I would just say like what Alfred Adler, he actually said that if like the child has a very satisfactory belonging from mother or father, right, and so that way he can understand that it's okay to be imperfect, right, sometimes, and that way he won't go for a superiority complex, right, and so he also said that with the superiority complex there is a underlying inferiority complex, right, and that's these are very complex things when with the single attitude of the parent, it influences the whole I would say flow, or how it generates the complexes within a child, right? And it's very it's actually very tough and very, I would say, harmful for the child.
Potentially, yes. I mean, I guess I guess the thing is, we're all flawed as human beings. There is no perfect human, and there's no perfect parent. And by and large, probably more and more today, parents do their best to parent. It's a concept now that we parent, and we read books on how to be a good parent, or how to do the right thing. But it's usually the things that it's usually in our blind spots. It's usually the things that we haven't been aware of or paid attention to that can leak out, and the child breaks a glass, and the mother, at the end of the day of being tired and managing work and children, reacts to it. And then probably afterwards thinks, oh, well, I wish I hadn't overreacted like that. So we do have, some space for repair, as parents, and that's I'm not sure if you're familiar with Bion, another very early psychoanalyst.
I'm not aware.
Bion talks about containment. But he also talks about, and that containment is a sort of a mental process that, a little bit like what Winnicott describes as holding. It's a function of how you or mentalize with, with your child. How do you know what it is that they're thinking and feeling? It's more complex than that, but it's in that reverie. It's in that thinking about how that impacts on a child that you can do the repair. But if that for some reason has been, that function hasn't developed early on, or has been, in some way disrupted, interrupted, then we've got a problem, because the mother is then unable, mother or father or primary care is unable to think, how might that have impacted on my child, and how can I do something to repair that? Then the repair doesn't happen. So this is the lack of mitigating,
that's true.
Elements.
And I believe that's the point where it leaves too much guilt on the parents as well, because I don't think so that none of the parents want like bad parenting for their child, right? So it somehow leaves a sense of guilt even on the parents, right? So how would you advise, right, even and the listeners, there might be some parents, right? How could they get over this and maybe integrate their own shadow, we could say in the Jungian terms, right? So how can they overcome their guilt of being bad parents, unfortunately? But it's the word used, right? So how can they overcome their guilt and actually work on that?
Well, I mean, I would always, I'm a strong advocate for therapy, obviously. And I think that for any parent, or anyone thinking about becoming a parent, can benefit from getting to know themselves, having the luxury of learning about their shadow and learning about, what drives them, or what might be lurking there that could be triggered, in any sort of overwhelming experience. And so, in one way, one thing that could be very helpful is for a parent to learn about and accept and love themselves for all of their, parts. And then, guilt serves a function. Guilt is an important thing for us all, really. It's sort of, in some way.
It actually helps us repair things.
It is like the superego, isn't it?
But again, that's a very good point you raised. I was thinking on that yesterday. But isn't there a very clear difference between superego and conscience?
Conscience.
Yeah, right. See, you said that it helps, and the guilt would serve as a function for superego, right? I believe if it's a superego, maybe I'm not like generalizing, but maybe in my subjective opinion, it might become toxic guilt, right? Because how guilt function is, it helps us repair for our mistakes or shortcomings, right? Which can be repaired, right? It's like accepting your shortcomings. It's okay, I'm capable of doing something bad, or it's okay to be imperfect. But again, it's like okay, I did that, that's fine, but that's the time to repair the thing, right? And
Mm.
that's the guilt. But when it's super ego criticizing, I believe that becomes a toxic guilt. And whereas the conscience, right, that's totally different. It's like a nurturing parent. It's criticizing but with compassion.
Well, I
So
guess, I mean, we can have our superego doesn't have to be toxic, but I
definitely.
think, when guilt stops being, I did something that I wish I hadn't done, and starts
Hmm.
being, I'm a bad person,
Hmm.
or I'm just wrong.
Hmm.
Then I think it's sort of crossing over the line to become shame. I think that perhaps could be how
Hmm.
shame, in a
Hmm.
more contemporary way, can be defined. Shame becomes this much more overwhelming and toxic.
Because shame is usually that uh, arises or originates from uh, mostly from comparison, and when one thinks that one is not good enough and one is not capable enough, right, then it's due to the low self-esteem. I believe that's where from where shame arises, when one one feels to be rejected, and one feels that one is not enough. Again, that's the low self-esteem, and that's from where shame and self-esteem, they move like very parallel. That's what I believe.
Yeah, and I think one way I think shame can develop is where, in the child's sense of being, the center of the universe,
Hmm.
and so therefore believing everything that happens around them is due
Hmm.
to them,
Hmm.
and then something really bad happens around them,
Hmm.
like, like family violence,
Hmm.
or like they've been removed from their parents' care and placed into foster care. Um,
Hmm.
when something, or the mother is unable to attune and meet their needs, and they're
Hmm.
neglected. If those two things coincide, then the child is already predetermined to blame themselves for what's happened, because of that egocentricity. So they take with them, the learning that they take with
Hmm.
them from that is, I
and
must be
that's
bad.
and that very
I'm
much
bad.
happens.
Mm. I work with a lot of children who are in the out-of-home care system, who are in foster care or in
Hmm.
residential care, and it becomes quite clear that's often at the bottom of,
Hmm.
a kind of a form of delinquency, for want of
Hmm.
a better word. That they don't have a balanced sort of internal guide for
That's
themselves.
true. Hmm.
So all
So,
those things.
so do you think that such children are very critical towards themselves?
Well, I think they stop being critical of themselves, because I think when shame is that, toxic, as you say, the experience of questioning yourself,
Hmm.
or appraising yourself,
Hmm.
is way too threatening.
Hmm.
I'm not going to begin to sort of examine myself when I already know deep down at the core of myself I'm bad. Because what I'm going to see if I start looking into myself is only going to be bad, and I can't tolerate it.
So,
So
so does that develop some kind of a masochistic personality?
potentially, or potentially a narcissistic one,
Uh-huh.
potentially one that is about
Actually, that's a very wonderful point. That's the point where people develop narcissistic personality. So, can we say that a wounded self or a wounded child, inner child, right, actually urges people to become narcissistic? Because that's like the underlying pattern which is being ignored, or which was ignored or traumatized, abused at one point, right? Which left unacknowledged, unrecognized, unloved, unvalidated, right? So that kind of expresses itself unconsciously in a very narcissistic way. So is that true?
I think that's very likely. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I think when we see adults with
Mm-hmm.
narcissism, what we're seeing is a secondary narcissism. It's
That's a very
not
interesting point.
it's not the infant that rarely, I think, is
Mm-hmm.
it the infant that was given everything they needed and the mother stopped doing, you know, that the mother, you know, never allowed that infant to separate from her.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we're seeing that so often. I think what we're seeing is the infant that was not permitted,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the experience of being the centre of the universe when they
Mm-hmm.
needed to be,
Mm-hmm.
and then the letting go of that didn't happen in a gentle and careful and caring way. So there was deprivation. You know, there was a catastrophic level of deprivation that
Mm-hmm.
required that infant to build a second skin, to find a different way to hold themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and and for survival. And that way of holding themselves is involved needing to feel that they're in control of everything, and
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, that they're going to be they're going to need to be meeting all of those primitive needs, you know, from here on, you know, that the world owes them
Mm-hmm.
something. Mm.
So, so do you think that like the trauma and shame are somehow related?
I do, yeah, I do. But I think when we say trauma, we're not just talking about those, you know, more concrete sort of definitions of trauma. Well, we're talking about the trauma of not having those primitive needs being met in the way that they need to be met. So
So,
that
so can we
it's
say them they were?
unintegrated.
So
Mm,
can we say them they were in a kind? They were in their own kind of trauma.
yeah, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
The lack of attunement, the lack of attachment is a type of trauma. Mm.
Mm-hmm. So we can say that it's very much linked to shame, right? And that obviously manifests throughout adulthood in the form of low self-esteem, and even as you mentioned, it was a very actually interesting point that you said that even like the secondary narcissistic behavior, right? That can
Mm.
also develop, right? So
Mm.
I have seen that people are labeled as narcissistic, right, in a very evil way, right? But
Mm.
but but they're wounded themselves. So
Absolutely.
right, that's what I always think. Don't you think that people label them as narcissistic would actually make their wound more deeper, and the recovery would be kind of more difficult? It's very much like, actually, I wrote something on that recently, that see, you see adults or childs with inferiority complex, right? They work hard and try to achieve something, perfection, or either self-destructive behavior, right? So
Mm.
they would go for superiority complex, right? Because
Mm.
that's just like they're hiding their inferiority. So once they were shamed, they were labeled as people with inferiority complex, right? When they strived harder, they were labeled as people with superiority complex. Isn't that irony? They are shamed both ways and labeled, tagged, right? And that was the actual example. So it's the same way happens with narcissistic, right? I'm not actually supporting someone, or I'm not encouraging someone to be a narcissistic. But what I'm saying is to know the reason or cause rather than labeling or tagging someone, right? Because I haven't even seen someone saying that a narcissistic has wounded themselves, right? Or they had a traumatized childhood, or they weren't loved, or they didn't receive enough love, right? What we hear is the post effects of narcissism or something like that, but we don't try to know the cause behind that. But that's
Well, I think modern psychiatry, tends to has moved away from understanding the origins
from like more we can say the depth psychology.
Well, I think I'm not sure if you're familiar with Darian Reader, who's a psychologist in England who's written some really interesting books recently around the mental life and the human condition. He writes about, there's one particular book I'm thinking of called the New Black, and it's about the experience of, a lot of what he's writing about is the experience of grief and mourning. It's about the difference.
I believe I read a very similar book to that, Grief and Mourning. I'm not sure if it's the same book, but it's a very interesting book. I read a book with a similar topic, and yes, that's the actually, I believe, to grieve, that's the art, right? And many of us don't know that, right? So I read a book, and it says that there are like different types of griefs, right? And there are some which aren't actually, or which can't be done or actually manifested due to the nature of loss, right? It's very awkward and it's very weird. I don't remember actually the name of that, but he actually named different types of grief, and I can't remember that. But it was a great book, and I believe the parents, when either father or mother, when really they get a problem or they had a hard time, right? When they don't grieve or mourn before a children, or then I think the children doesn't learn how to do that. What happens is, whenever the children suffers from something, and when he actually suffers, he thinks that he's being awkward because he didn't see his parents, or she didn't see her parents doing that. Because what happens is, parents really hide that we shouldn't be doing such things in front of our child, right? Because that could have a negative.
So the inadvertent message they received is it's not okay to express the sadness or your loss.
And that's what very, very much happens. It's just like, maybe people have introduced, unfortunately, their own psychology or psychoanalytic perspective of everything. But I actually read an article on that, because it pretty much have impact on the child. If you don't grieve, or if you don't show sorrow and proper emotions, right? You don't stay authentic with your emotions, right? I'm not saying to just burst in front of the child, but be authentic to your emotions, and do that in a very healthy way, right? That would actually help child internalize that these are all kind of emotions, and it's actually fine to have them. Isn't that? What do you think on that?
I think it's important, I think, I think, again, in an attuned relationship between a parent and a child, they're going to know if, if an abundance of their own emotion is going to burden the child, they're going to know, well, that's going to be too much for my 2-year-old or 3-year-old to know about. There's going to be some awareness there of how much they can, how much they can express themselves in front of their child. They may not, for example, express their full rage in front of a 2-year-old, because that could potentially be very frightening to the 2-year-old and overwhelming. And so I guess again, what we need to come back to is that delicate relationship. Or perhaps it's not as delicate as, maybe it needs to be more robust. That relationship needs to be one where there's a very clear knowing from a parent what it is they can share. But I guess my point when I was talking about Darian Reeder's book was, he also talks about how, which I think is a really interesting thing for us to be aware of in our sector of our work, is how the influence of big pharmaceutical companies on the way we think about our mental life. Because now, when we're looking at psychiatry, moving towards DSM diagnoses, that often will then be the forerunner to a prescription of medication. Then, where is the space for understanding that what might be lying underneath those criteria that can be added together to come to a diagnosis. I think what we were talking about prior to that a little bit was labels and putting a label on somebody who might present
I think is that
we're all a little bit narcissistic. We all have.
We are. That's the thing. That's actually integrating your own shadow, right? In the Jungian terms.
Yeah.
I don't think so. If I'm not generalizing, but I don't think so. There's anyone who's not a narcissistic, right? We all are. It's just like, who's brave enough to acknowledge that. But if someone is, then they actually don't project on someone else. So actually, from like therapists or expert people, at least they should avoid, I think so, they should avoid labeling and tagging people maybe with such narcissistics or something like that. Because for diagnosis is something else. But when you actually label someone out of pride or just for the sake of labeling, it doesn't heal someone. That's what I think.
You have to wonder, don't you? How helpful is it? Some people think that it might be helpful, perhaps, to know, well, I have depression, for example, or I have anxiety, or but some of those labels, as you say, they're denigrating, and they can have secondary or multiple consequences to that person's not only that person's sense of self, but their functionality in the world.
Exactly. It doesn't heal them. It just makes things more worse. That's what I personally think. So here comes another question. Like, so what's the way to healing for people with a childhood trauma or shame, low self-esteem? And one more extension to the question here. Do you think that one way to healing is that their trauma, their wounds should be validated? Because I have seen people actually I've seen a lot of people, they actually make it more worse, saying that validation of a wound is actually somehow trying to boost your ego. So
I guess it depends on the context of that. I think the validation of a wound or emotional experience, painful experience, in the context of a compensatory experience of being held in mind
Mm-hmm.
and thought about
Mm-hmm.
and accepted and appreciated could be quite helpful, for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, when I see children who who have come to me with a history of at least one experience of trauma, if not multiple,
Mm-hmm.
healing doesn't involve, let's talk about that time daddy smacked you. Healing isn't about us trying to pin down that one or two, that one of those moments that they
Mm-hmm.
experience that trauma. Largely what it involves is them having an experience of someone building an internal mitigating function for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So building internally, or them internalizing the experience of themselves being experienced as important,
Mm-hmm.
as themselves being experienced as valid as a human being, and provided with a rhythm and a predictable pattern of relating. That's
So, mhm.
normally experienced as a positive thing, as an enjoyable thing that they're enjoyed.
Mhm. So, like, if someone reaches at like adulthood, right, at some stage, maybe 23, 20, or 18, 19, and he develops a strong personality, he develops a strong ego, healthy ego, if he does, how can he at that point heal his traumas himself? Because there needs to be some point where he needs to accept that, where, because mostly when we don't accept that, we project on people outside, right? We project everything, our burden, our problems, our issues on everyone else, right?
Mm.
So what do you think could be the way towards healing of such adults? Because throughout the childhood, I don't think so they get stable enough to heal themselves, right? But when they get conscious enough, what steps could be taken, or how can they generally uh, work on themselves?
Look, I think that there probably could be many ways, but one way that I think can be really helpful is psychoanalysis,
Mm-hmm.
or an opportunity to free associate with somebody who is reliably, predictably, there for you to
Mm-hmm.
catch what you put out into the world
Mm-hmm.
and help you make meaning of it, and be curious with you, develop a curiosity within you,
Mm-hmm.
through their curiosity of you, that allows you to build an internal mechanism of always thinking through
Mm-hmm.
the significance of things that happen in your day-to-day life.
So do
You've
you think like
been
observing
ruminating on something, you develop this curiosity within that says, why am I stuck on thinking about this? Why is this still going on in my mind? Why am I, regurgitating this same thing in
Mhm.
my head?
Mhm.
The experience of therapy allows you to have a way of, looking in at that.
Mhm. So
But
do you think
I
like
think
our relation with people, like with the friends or everyone around us, actually can help us do better introspection?
it depends on the friends, maybe. Some friends I think are a little bit more capable to do
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
Generally, though, in my experience, I hold back a lot with friends. I don't feel
Mhm.
like I want to burden friends.
That's
Um,
another problem. That's a very good point actually you raised. So what I thought was, maybe I'm wrong, what I always thought, that mostly like people who have a masochistic personality, right? They really think that it's not okay, like on a general skill, right? What I thought, that it's not okay you would burden someone sharing, and the people who are very much empathetic, right? They also think that it's not good to burden someone, it's not good to share that. It's good to care for people, right? But
Mm.
when that gets pathological, it's very weird, isn't it? So that's another problem in its own, right? That when I don't know, but what do you think about that? I think that's another huge problem that you.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I think, yeah, it probably is something to kind of unpack,
Exactly.
in a bigger way, because I think it probably ties into other parts of our sort of social being. How does our
Hmm.
society impact on how we think
Hmm.
about what we give and take? We live in, well, you live at the moment in a
And
capitalist
and
society where,
interestingly, that's the point where superego and conscience pops in. I'll tell
yeah.
you how. I'll tell how. I'm not an expert. I'm just sharing my own subjective opinion. So I think if with all the experiences someone had, if they are not satisfactory, or they did not have like good relation with the parents and everyone around, then they may think that everything what happens is just because of them, right? So
Mm,
with all their relation with the things, with the happenings, with the situations, they would think that they are the reason, right? They That's like I call it a dark parental ego, and
mm,
that's which comes in, and it's not it's not a conscience. There's a difference here between superego and conscience, right?
mm,
So
mm.
conscience would be very different. It would be completely different than the superego here. What do you think?
Mm. Well, there's certainly a distortion, maybe a distortion of a superego,
Mhm.
where it's a very negative, very harsh,
Exactly. Yep.
punishing, very
Yep.
punishing.
And that's pretty much shaped by your childhood experiences, isn't it?
It can be, I think. Yeah, I
Hmm.
think so. If our superego is largely made up of what we introject from the parent within our parent, because they've got that from somewhere too, probably from their own parent.
That's true.
If we're introjecting that, and we're introjecting not only our parent, but generations.
Ancestral, trauma travels
Yeah.
through generations.
And so if we ourselves, I think back to 4 generations
Hmm.
before my mother, and the
Hmm.
kind of ways that children were thought about and disciplined, and then we've got a line here of potentially very harsh
Hmm.
disciplinarian style, ways to teach children. So, so that can be a battle. It can
Hmm.
be an internal battle.
Hmm.
Um,
But at some point, I think someone needs to look within themselves, their relation with others, and that's the best way I think to do introspection, and that's the point where they actually need to look how they are projecting things outside, how actually uh, their childhood wounds are being manifested unconsciously in some destructive way, right?
mm,
That's the point I think, uh, where people get conscious of things, observe
mm,
their inner emotions, right, feelings, and how they are manifested in certain situations, how they're being triggered when with certain people, right? So that certain trigger at certain point with certain people might help you locate your wound or trauma. I think so. It might be like that, but obviously
mm.
not an expert opinion. I think so.
Yeah, I'm just, as you were talking then, I was thinking about this current mask wearing debate, that's going on. And, the purpose of us wearing a mask, as
Mm-hmm.
I understand it, is one about us protecting everyone else, because, we're not actually protected very much by the mask, but we're protecting everyone else because we're stopping our aerosol going further.
Mm-hmm.
So we're creating a filter in a way, and we're filtering out what is coming out of us. We don't even know what it is that we have in us that's coming
Mm-hmm.
out. We don't know if we have the virus or not.
That's true.
Because often we can be asymptomatic, and
Mm-hmm.
if I go and visit my my partner's mother who's in her 90s, and I don't know I have the virus, and I'm not wearing a mask, I could, she could wind up very, very ill, and potentially that could be fatal at her age.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the wearing of a mask is about acknowledging that we don't know what we have and what we're projecting out.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if there was a way of us knowing what we have and what we could be projecting out, then it's a sort of it perhaps is a moral issue. Are we checking out what have we got a virus? Have we got
Mm-hmm.
something that we could
Mm-hmm.
put out
Mm-hmm.
there on someone very
Mm-hmm.
vulnerable? Yeah. So if we were able to do that, then maybe that is a morally responsible thing to do, and protect.
Mm-hmm.
Especially if we're thinking about being around children
Mm-hmm.
or parenting.
I
Maybe.
think it takes us back to again the same cycle. How I'll tell you, like, see, acknowledgement of a shadow, right? Or
Mm,
anything which challenges our ego, conscious ego. When we do that, that's a very brave act, to be honest.
mm,
Integrating your shadow or accepting that. So when you do that, that means you have almost the half of the solution lies there when you acknowledge the uh, any any kind of problem that's very much against morality, right? Or that's very much against your conscious ego. So that takes us again to the same cycle, I believe. If someone had a traumatic childhood, right? I don't think so that they would be good in integrating their shadow, accepting all those behaviors which are not considered morally good. Their shadow would be very much darker, denser, or I would wonder if they get identified with their shadow, in fact. And that pretty
mm,
much happens, I think so. Like the people who are traumatized, they might get identified to their shadow, right?
mm,
They
mm,
might consider themselves damaged goods, right? That's a
mm,
term very much used. So for them, integrating the shadow is again taking them back to their cycle in childhood, and that's very pretty much difficult because they already have sense of shame, inferiority, and imagine how would they again face something that goes against moral, right? Again,
mm,
a critical superego would come and punish them, and it becomes very hard. I read one of the book of Dr. Murray Stein. He's a very famous Jungian analyst. He said that some people have a very kind persona, very nurturing, soft, but for their that's for other people, right? But for themselves, they are very much critical. They are very
mm,
much punishing. See, and that's what happens, I believe, with people having a traumatic background or traumatic childhood. They
mm,
are they are very much critical, hard towards their own selves, but they develop persona and a kind of a mask for other people.
mm,
I'm not generalizing it, but it happens. I think so, right? Everything I'm saying is totally my subjective opinion. It's not like I'm not saying it's statistically proven or something like that. Most of psychology, it's an artwork, right? More than like
mm,
more like it isn't like psychiatry where the facts and you prove something. It's more like an artwork. So I think so.
I think
That
so.
happens.
I mean, you might have heard of, Winnicott's idea about the false self.
Exactly. Yep.
A persona.
Hmm.
Perhaps is a different word for it, or slightly different
No,
concept.
but that's almost the same thing. Yeah,
Mm.
or having a false self or persona, but they are kind of interlinked. That's true, and
Mm.
it actually takes us far away from our real self, right? And
Well, absolutely, because really, it's kind of a twofold situation that the
mhm,
persona is developed in the absence of what it's needed. So
mhm,
so if this is a false self that develops in infancy,
mhm,
the infant begins to hold the mother.
mhm,
Begins to actually give to the mother what the infant needs from her. So not only is this persona not allowing the bringing in of what the baby needs,
mhm,
it's also giving out something and reinforcing an
mhm,
idea that it doesn't need. So neglects the self, and doesn't know themselves, doesn't know what they really need, doesn't exist in a sense.
mhm,
It's quite a catastrophic picture.
mhm,
Um, but nonetheless, if this is as a therapist, if this is what's going on with a therapist, the therapist
mhm,
would know that,
mhm,
ideally, because they've had their own therapy, so that those things can be explored, and the self can be better integrated
mhm.
prior to delivery of therapy.
It seems like the family relationships, they are very dynamic things. They're very complex, right? And I always wonder that they can have a long lasting impact on the child, right? And the
Mm.
child can suffer throughout the adulthood and even throughout the life. And I believe it can never be ignored. Some people think that, okay, it happened in childhood, but one should work on that, right?
Mm.
I always considers, because Nietzsche always had such a prose of a superhero, or actually his three stages of metamorphosis. They're really good, and from, I believe, spirit, sheep, lion, camel, and then the child.
Mm.
And they're very good, taking the burden of society, and then actually like camel taking burden, and then holding the burden and facing people, facing your shadow. That's like lion, and then finally comes the child. So it's a
Mm.
very much interesting point. But obviously we need externally people, a community, a healing community. I
Mm.
always believe that we need a healing community for that,
Mm.
because it's not always a single individual task. It can take sometimes lifetime for a trauma.